Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to be painting another made up landscape in one colour, Paynes grey, very loose and very semi-abstract from my imagination. I often do this if I don't know what to paint, it gets me going, or as a warm-up exercise, again, to sort of get me used to the beauty of watercolour and the flow of watercolour. And once I've painted something like this, then I feel much freer and more expressive and ready to go in and paint a sort of more complex painting from one of my photographs or from sketches, that sort of thing. So I've wet my paper all over. It's Saunders Waterford hot pressed paper this time because I want a lovely flow of paint on the smooth surface of the paper, and I'm using this handled bamboo hake brush that I got from AliExpress with the Paynes grey to run some shapes and dots mostly across the horizon, because that's where I want to build up the base for my semi-abstract landscape. I'm just letting the brush dance around, thick blobs here, diffusions there, allowing the paint to run but keeping my marks mostly horizontal. And this way I'm hoping that I will begin to see something that I can make from it, some sort of a landscape emerging. And I'm liking the look of it so far. I'm going to keep it fairly simple. I'm not going to add too much else to it in the foreground. Just a few marks, a few sort of shallow diagonal marks, and allow the paint to run on the wet paper. But I'm seeing, I think, a distant tree line and some fields or something like that at the moment. So just staying very, very loose, just putting marks here and there, as I say, just trying to loosen up and really relax and let the paint do the work and see what happens. Just trying to put in a bit of suggested detail with richer, thicker paint and the tips of the brush across the foreground. A slight angle here offsets the very straight horizon line. Just continuing to build up lots more texture across the foreground, but without overdoing it too much. I want to keep this nice and loose. You can turn and tip and tilt your board. Don't forget you can do that, or your pad or your block, whatever you're painting on. I saw a little drop of water and some damp paper there, so I'm just going to encourage the paint to run down that a little bit further. That should just give me, I think, an extra sort of plane of distance, like a distant field boundary or something like that. The more you experiment with these kinds of methods, and especially just using the one colour, you're not bogged down by making any colour choices. You can just freely use the paint and just see what happens when you paint wet in wet. See how the paint diffuses, what happens when you put thick paint on thin paint, and how effective it is to leave large areas of white unpainted paper in your foreground. I'm just sweeping across some quite pale and watery Paynes grey, using horizontal sweeps of my brush to create a sky. One thing I don't want to do is come down and disturb the top of that tree line as I see it at the moment. So I'm just trying to create this very gentle graduated wash for the sky, softening back with a damp brush here and there, just so I don't get any hard marks, but trying to avoid, as I say, that clump of trees in the middle, because if I touch that with wet paint, then it'll probably burst out into the sky. I don't really want that. And I think I'm more or less happy with that. To me, it looks like a line of distant trees, maybe some snowy fields and field boundaries, that sort of thing. So I think I'm almost ready to let it dry. But while the paint is still quite moist and thick in the background, I'm going to pull through using the corner of a plastic store card and etch out some paler indications of trunks and branches, just to kind of cement that look of those trees and make them look a little bit, give them a little bit more realism. I'm now going to lay my painting completely flat and let it dry. It's completely dry, and I must admit I'm very happy with how it's looking at the moment as a semi-abstract landscape. I mean, you can kind of read anything into a lot of these marks. That's the joy of painting like this. It can be such an expressive way of painting. But I've decided, looking at it, that I would like to turn this mid-ground area coming up to the foreground into a lake. And put some reflections in. So I'm going to use my squirrel mop and soften some of the edges and put some water across the lake area now, so that I can get some nice soft diffusions when I drop some paint in. I'm back to this bamboo hake brush, again purchased from AliExpress, and no, I'm afraid I don't have the link, I didn't keep that, but if you go online you can probably find them. I'm dropping in more Paynes grey because this is just using the one colour, the monotone. You could use any colour for a scene like this, it doesn't have to be Paynes grey or black. I'm sure it'd be really beautiful if you did it in a nice rich red or pink or maybe sepia, something like that. Just experiment and have fun and find your own way of creating these kinds of things. As I say, it's a lovely way to warm up before you sort of get into a more planned and prepared watercolour. It just gets you ready and prepared to exploit those sort of wet in wet moments when the magic really happens with watercolour. So I'm building up my lighter and darker horizontal areas across this lake, hoping to build up the look of the light reflected on the water, ripples, that sort of thing. Then once I've got that to where I like the look of it, then I shall pull down some reflections from those distant trees. Going backwards and forwards with my hake brush, my squirrel mop, and I'll probably use a flat brush as well, a normal sort of 3/4 inch synthetic flat brush. This helps me to pull through some, sort of feather through some lines through the damp paint, and helps me to flatten out the look of the water a bit more now that I've got my shades and tones in. This brush is a Cotman brush, synthetic, and I think 3/4 inch flat, and it's a lovely brush to use. I really like it. Now I think this is a little bit patchier than I want, so with a dip of water, I'm going to go over the whole lake area and just smooth it out a little bit more. Still trying to keep it slightly darker at the front than it is at the back. And now I'm going to dip into some very dark Paynes grey and, using the flat brush, pull down into the wet paint some reflections. Just the rough kind of similar size to the block of distant trees. And I'm hoping that as my board is at an angle of about 45 degrees, that gravity will just help to soften and bring down these reflections a little bit more. I'm hoping that they'll look quite effective. Going across the whole lake and putting in a few of these reflections for each of these little groups of distant trees. Keep reloading my brush with more Paynes grey to make sure that my reflections are nice and dark. And I think that will do for the reflections. I'll just allow them to diffuse and let the lake dry. And while it's drying, I'll go in with my number 1 rigger and paint in a stark leafless tree, sort of quite a stylized tree, which I think will contrast nicely with the very dark impressions of trees across the back on the distant horizon line. Sorry that my hand's in the way there, but it's literally just using the tips of the rigger and drawing up from that horizon line into a sort of loose, quite delicate tree shape. And I can see now that this tree is really helping the rest of the composition. Just a tiny bit of detail like this is pulling the painting together quite nicely. I shall pull out a few of these fine branches from the top of this mass of trees here as well. You could add some leaves to your trees if you want, but I think I like this one and these branches left bare. And I think that looks okay. I think they've added to this semi-abstract landscape quite a lot. I'm now going to leave everything to dry completely, and then once it's dry, I'll come back and finish off the water, just put a few more details and ripples into the surface. It's dried off now, so I'm taking my wet flat brush and drawing it through the reflection, and then I'll leave it for a few seconds, and then with a tissue or a paper towel I'll wipe through that line, and that should give me a nice sort of water line through the reflection. And I'll repeat that a few times here and there throughout the water, and then feather my flat brush across the water horizontally to add a few more marks, and then I shall dip into some Paynes grey and add even more reflections. So I'm combining lifting out some water lines with feathering through and softening the existing paint, and then adding a few more little reflections too. Keeping those lines nice and horizontal, but curving the lines a little bit down towards the corner as I get to the foreground where the ripples follow the kind of lay of the land. And now the finishing touch, some slightly darker Paynes grey, carefully placed in sort of in a sort of a band through the water, keeping the strokes horizontal, and then a little bit on in this pale patch of water here, but not too much. I want to keep that nice and plain, and a little bit more light in there. And I think I'm going to call that finished. Well, apart from drying time, that only took about sort of 12 to 15 minutes to paint. And It was a lot of fun and I'm really pleased with it. If I remove the tape, then you can see how it comes together beautifully as a semi-abstract lake landscape with these trees in the distance. But interestingly enough, I've just noticed that my bare tree, or my dead leafless tree, is not reflected in the lake. So I think I better do something about that. I'm just going to quickly add a bit of reflection with the Paynes grey and my rigger brush, just bringing it down in a sort of wriggly line that sort of imitates the shape of the tree above, sort of just a vague sort of similarity. And I think that will do. I think also probably what I need to do is just slightly soften off the reflection on the far right, but I think the tree looks better now. I hadn't noticed that when I was painting it. It's quite interesting how when you take the tape off, you see the painting in fresh eyes and you suddenly notice things that you might have forgotten. So now, again, I shall finally call this one finished, and I hope that you enjoyed watching it. Thank you so much for watching and for your support here on YouTube. Please give us a thumbs up, and also subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, as it really helps my reach. And thanks so much to my lovely Patreon group who support this channel. I'll see you again soon. Take care and happy painting. Bye.